How we doing? How we doing? This is Destination Denver, Colorado, and today I'm channeling my inner Biggie and Tupac. We're talking east suburbs of Denver to west suburbs of Denver, east versus west. Let's get it starting right now. All right, this is Destination Denver, Colorado. I'm your host, Jimmy Everett, and listener. If you're interested in learning all the ins and outs, pros and cons to moving to or around Denver, Colorado, then this is a channel for you. So that subscribe button and notification icon you see on your screen, make sure you click on that as I'm dropping new videos for you each and every week. And as much as I try to be a little informative here on camera, I'm also a licensed mortgage broker covering the entire state of Colorado and team with some of Denver's most talented realtors. And we are helping people move here each and every day. So the number and email you see on your screen, know that I am always the person answering your phone calls, answering your texts, answering your emails. There, winning if you need me. And now that we're done with that fun-filled stuff, let's get to what we're here for, and that is the comparison of what it's like to live on the eastern suburbs to the western suburbs of Denver. So before we really dive in, I want to talk about what east of Denver looks like compared to what west of Denver looks like. Because one thing that you're going to see is that if you Google, east of Denver is primarily Aurora. It's the suburb or city of Aurora, which is the third largest city in Colorado behind Denver and behind Colorado Springs. So Aurora is its own massive area, really sprawling, very large. Whereas on the west side of town, that same amount of geographical space will be taken up by multiple suburbs: Arvada, Wheat Ridge, Lakewood, Littleton, Golden. So Aurora kind of has this whole encompassing aspect, and we'll talk about areas also south of Aurora like Parker, whereas the west is going to be chopped into more suburbs. So today's video, we're going to take it a little back and forth. We're going to talk about different segments of living, if you will, and going back east to west. So starting out with housing, here's the first stunner you're going to hear. So although Denver gets this like mystique that it's a mountain town, we're not. Denver is located on the flat plains of eastern Colorado, and then about 15 to 20 minutes west of Denver, you get into the mountains. So the east suburbs of Denver are pretty much, for the most part, as flat as it gets. And because of that, the housing in these communities could be well planned out. There's some reasoning behind many of the neighborhoods and many of the roads because they just had this flat land to go out on. It's like Sim City back in the day. Whereas when you look to the western suburbs, you're going to see a little less planning because they had to. Whereas when you look to many of the western suburbs, specifically ones like Lakewood where I live, Golden, Morrison, you're going to find that developers throughout the 1900s and into the early 2000s had to account for the fact that you had rolling hills up to mountains in the way of their development, so they really had to work around it. You'll see a lot of neighborhoods where they just kind of fit things in as they could around the fact that they only had so much room to work with. The second big thing that you're going to see in difference between eastern Colorado or eastern Denver and western Denver is just the difference in how the eastern suburbs of Aurora, especially because of their proximity to Denver and again just how they were developed for years and years, has a bit more of an urban feel to it. There's a lot more commercial space to it. It's more congested in areas. We'll get to that, but you kind of get that feel. The western suburbs at the time kind of had a mountain feel to many of them, and so you do not get nearly as much of the urban vibe as you go west. I like to use the term vibe, sorry ahead of time, but I think you'll feel a lot more suburb-ish as you get west. And in many ways, some of these western communities will also have that small town aspect to it. Towns like Old Town Arvada, downtown Littleton, downtown Golden, Morrison all have that feel. When you go to the eastern side of town, when you go to Aurora, you don't really see any of that. Parker has some of it to the south, but eastern Denver, not so much. Now, staying on housing, the east side of Denver does tend to have more affordability, not just from a cost of living, but from a cost of housing. It's a very desirable place from that standpoint where whether it's first-time home buyers, whether it's renters, what have you, they tend to get more bang for their buck on the east side of town. Now, this has evolved a bit. There are some, especially newer communities on the eastern side of town or new developments where that price point can go up, but you tend to see more affordability. The west side of town, again, so much of this comes back to geography. Because of its limited space, there just isn't as many houses available in some of these communities on the west side of town. And because of that, the price point has, for the most part, tended to be higher than what you'll see in Aurora and most of that community. So another aspect that you're going to see in housing on the east side of town is because there is this land and this flat land, there's this big emphasis on development. You see a lot more of new construction. You see a lot more of new communities being built, some of them of huge substance. I talk a lot about the Southlands area of Aurora, neighborhoods like Talon's Reach, Blackstone, South Shore, all around the Southlands Mall. And these new communities developed in the last handful of years just were not there, did not exist, and now they are huge components of Aurora. You see that sprawl of growth also in areas south of Denver. It's southeast, but I would still count it in this video in Parker. You'll see that growth. You see a lot more of it there. On the west side of town, again, we go back to that limited space. So you have an emphasis on growth is only in specific areas. Lakewood, as an example, the community I live in has a 1% rule. That means every year combined, they can only build the total number of houses in existence. You can only increase it by 1%. It makes building very difficult. You'll see a little bit of that sprawl in areas like Golden. There's more development there, and you'll see it in Littleton. But in many of the other communities, Lakewood, Wheat Ridge only has so much space, Arvada, so much space. You tend to see less of it by far than you will on the east side of town. Now, because of that, you'll see this twofold. You'll see areas that are growing in desirability, like that Southlands area, like the Stapleton, now called Central Park, area of eastern Denver. And you see that a little bit in Littleton, areas like Sterling Ranch. You'll see it in areas of Arvada. You'll see it in areas of Golden. One thing to be aware of that you see predominantly on the east side of town is because of these new developments, you tend to see higher property taxes in specific regions of Aurora and eastern Denver. Specifically, again, because of new development. If it's new construction tends to come, or new developments tend to come with higher property taxes. There are fewer newer development projects being done on the west side of town, so you can count on some of these older neighborhoods to have lower property taxes because of that. And this will continue. There are plans for more and more new developments, new areas. Highlands, Aurora Highlands is the talk of the town right now, a very popular new site. So you've got a lot of development on the east side of town, a lot of big projects planned for in the future. So again, if you're looking for that development aspect, the eastern suburbs are going to be primarily your focus. And when it comes to housing, because of how populated the eastern suburbs can be, you tend to see more traffic congestion on that side of town. There's just more people. I also think just from the way the roads were constructed, they just tend to get busier. It tends to be more difficult to get from one end of Aurora to the other, or down into Parker, where you really only have Parker Road to get in and out. So traffic congestion can be worse. That's not to say that on the western suburbs we don't have traffic. You just see more congestion on the east side of town than you tend to on the west. And having confirmed this with enough clients and colleagues, I also think that you tend to see the western suburbs being quieter because there is less congestion, because there is less commercial, because there are less businesses and industries. The western suburbs tend to be, I want to say calmer, but certainly quieter. Definitely that more suburb feel, whereas in parts of the eastern suburbs and parts of Aurora, you're going to get a lot of congestion, you're going to get more noise, you're going to get more people. And I know I've talked about new developments that are occurring and the fact that they are more prominent or there's more planned on the east side of Denver. But something that I want to talk about when you talk about these planned development communities. So the western suburbs of Denver were not necessarily planned developments. And what I mean by that is the idea that a community would have all of its amenities within this specific region. South of Denver is an area called Highlands Ranch. And Highlands Ranch was one of the original planned developments where they thought through, we're going to put rec centers in these different areas. We're going to put shopping centers and your restaurants and all of the amenities that you need so that anyone living in Highlands Ranch can kind of stay within this bubble and they have just about everything. They don't have to leave if they don't want to. You don't see that in communities in the western suburbs of Denver. You don't see it in Wheat Ridge or Lakewood, Littleton. It just wasn't the thought process at the time. You see that in many communities now in especially Southeast Aurora, where they learned this lesson, and that's an adjustment that they've made. You see it in Sterling Ranch, really the one big planned development on the western suburbs in Littleton. But that's just a huge difference between the east side of town and west side of town, the whole planning purpose. And this also is going to tie in later when I talk about leisure to the fact that they thought through trails and walking paths to get you from one place to another so that they were all intertwined. From an economic standpoint, you're going to see that there tends to be a lot of industry tied to Aurora. Many education, healthcare, finance, healthcare being a big one. The Anschutz campus, kind of in the heart of Aurora, not far from downtown Denver, is a major facility, both from a healthcare standpoint and from an education standpoint. It is a major target or location for people coming to Colorado in the medical field to study. And so while plenty of people in Aurora will transit to other locations for work, there's plenty of industry and commerce within Aurora itself for people. Whereas on the west side of town, that can be hit or miss. You could be in kind of more of a hub of the economy areas. You know, I think each of these suburbs, Golden has its downtown area, Littleton, Arvada, as I mentioned earlier. They have their small economic hubs, not quite to the size and substance that you will see on the east side of town, and certainly plenty of people transporting into Denver. So you tend to see more industry on the east suburbs. That's, again, not to say that the west is without, or that the east just takes care of itself, but a little heavier economically on the east side of town. Jumping into lifestyle, I think this one is tricky because if you ask people, tend to say, oh, the western suburbs, they get to the mountains and they're hiking and they're biking. Well, I honestly don't buy that. I think that mountain people who live on the western side of town get to the mountains more often than mountain people who live on the east side of town, just because of that convenience factor. But I think that people who like the mountains will find a way to get to the mountains. They might be able to get there, a couple extra times if they are closer. That's certainly a big part of leisure on the west side of town. Now, so we talked earlier about planned developments. The other aspect of that, as I mentioned, is that they really thought through parks and trails and ways to connect and different amenities for families to enjoy. So you see a lot more of that on the east side of town in newer development properties. You see that to the south of Denver to some extent. When it comes to the western suburbs, you really only see that in areas like a Sterling Ranch in Littleton, where they have your amenities, your coffee shops, your restaurant, your healthcare, your rec center. You don't see that in Lakewood. There's no real planning behind this. So we have 100 parks, but you don't have necessarily, trails that interconnect to go to this playground, to go over to this park, to do this. If it's there, it's just because they were close to each other in the first place, but you don't see that planning aspect to it. On the east side of town, you see a lot more. The other aspect of the east side of town is you see a lot more walkability as far as walking malls, shops, things of that nature. Again, you start to see a little bit of that in the western suburbs. Down the road from my house is Belmar, a community I talk about a lot, a walking mall. It's kind of Lakewood's downtown, but not as much. You see more of those downtowns that I mentioned earlier on the west side of town, the Goldens, the Arvadas. I just like repeating myself apparently in this video. Whereas the eastern suburbs, you don't see that. Most of the eastern suburbs, Parker has a downtown. Aurora really doesn't. It just sprawls. So it's more walking malls, things of that nature. And last couple things to hit on are transportation. Now, I think transportation, especially when it comes to the light rail, is going to be very specific to where you are. There are parts of Aurora in which the light rail is going to be very useful. Similar on the west side of town, there are parts of Arvada, Lakewood, Golden, and Littleton in which the light rail is going to be beneficial. But if you're not along those lines, it really doesn't exist for you. You can't get to Parker on the light rail. It's just a line that is missing. And admittedly, I don't know if they have plans for that in the near future. But there is a larger reliance on public transportation, whether that's Uber, Lyft, or on cabs on the east side of town, people tend to be a little closer from a transportation standpoint to getting to and from their work or their amenities, especially if they're in the western side of Aurora, pretty close to downtown. And obviously from a transportation standpoint, if you're on the east side of town, you're gonna have quicker access, odds are, to Denver International Airport. And if you're on the west side of town, no duh, you have closer access to the mountains. A little give and take, whether you're flying or skiing. And last, let's touch on crime real quick. And again, I'll say it in every single video, do your due diligence, check out stats, do your research before moving to any location. You're gonna find that crime tends to follow population density. The east side of town and parts of Aurora specifically have this reputation. And listen, growing up in Lakewood has its own reputation. There are certain areas of Lakewood that are considered more dangerous, more crime infested, if you will, than others. I think, again, do your research there. I think that reputation that Aurora has, much of it is outdated, just as Lakewood's is, but there are certainly areas. Again, I feel for Aurora because Lakewood deals with the same thing and the same reputations. There are certain areas that you're going to want to pay closer attention to than others. And as you get farther and farther into the suburban sprawl, if you will, in both directions, fewer people tends to lead to fewer issues, if you will. I'm not saying it's a panacea. It clarifies everything, but certainly something to consider. Overall, the biggest thing that you're going to find when it comes to Denver is the fact that people who live on one side of town or the other, specifically people who grew up on one side of town or the other, tend to really like being on that side of town. I know people who grew up in the western suburbs couldn't imagine living in the east, and the people living in the east couldn't imagine living on the west. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to your leisure, how you like the neighborhoods, and how you like the developments. There's a lot to like about both sides of town. I mean, I might be a West Sider, but I can still respect what the East has going for it. Because at the end of the day, I loved Tupac and I loved Biggie. But we can debate all sorts of things. East Coast, West Coast, rap today, rap later. That's the perfect opportunity to hit me with a comment or hit me with a phone call. The phone number and email. Again, words not coming out of my mouth. Phone number and email popping up on your screen. Know that I am always the person. Answer your phone calls, answer your texts, answer your emails. This is Destination Denver, Colorado. I'm your host, Jimmy Everts. That was Living in Denver, Colorado, comparing the east suburbs to the west suburbs. Until I see you next time, peace.